The early 2000s were an absolutely wild time for Captain America. He's killed off in February 2002, then a month later he's back in the Dead Men Running miniseries, which, despite the title, has nothing to do with his death the previous month. They never ever addressed him getting killed. I guess reports of his death were exaggerated, I don't know. Then we get the Marvel Knights series, which I want to give a little bit of a pass to, as my understanding is writer John Nay Ryber had to alter his plans for the series after 9/11. But he didn't have to alter his plans to suck so much. Our first arc is illustrated by the late John Cassaday, and his work is easily the best thing about the first 16 issues, which is all I read. This story briefly shows Captain America reacting to 9/11, acting like he could have done something. Not sure how, but whatever. Then, a few months later, a small middle American town gets bombed by a mysterious group of terrorists led by a guy who is mad at American war crimes committed in his country. We're never told which country. That's the point. It could be any of them, because America is evil. Now, this is comics we're talking about, and terrorism, so no laughing matter. I'm not a blind patriot. I recognize my nation isn't perfect. We've got some skeletons in the closet. But yelling about how awful America is 10 seconds after 9/11 is a lot like kicking a man who has testicular cancer and his wife just left him. It is so bizarre that as a reaction to America being the victims in 9/11, Reber decided to write a story where, from the villain's perspective, it's America's fault this is happening. But that isn't even in the top 5 weirdest things about this run. Cap is curious how these terrorists made it 300 miles into American airspace undetected, and you know what? I'm curious too, as that's never answered. He discovers the terrorists have this technology S.H.I.E.L.D. tried to give him, and when he asks the reasonable question of how they got this, Nick Fury tries to help, but Secretary Dahl says he's not cleared for that. He says, "Make the call," and 10 seconds later, the terrorists try to kill Cap. This seems to indicate Dahl, via S.H.I.E.L.D., is in bed with the terrorists, but that's never spelled out either. The police arrest the terrorists, so I guess if S.H.I.E.L.D. was working with them, they weren't that close. Turns out the terrorists put this technology in some company, and that's how S.H.I.E.L.D. got a hold of it. But this doesn't explain how the terrorists snuck into American airspace, or why Secretary Dahl didn't want Cap to know we share contact with the terrorists, or how the terrorists were able to find Cap so quickly after Dahl ordered Fury to make the call. None of that is ever addressed. I assume because Reber wasn't interested in this arc and wanted to move on to what was supposed to be the opening of this series. Which brings us to The Extremists, illustrated by Trevor Hairsine and later Jay Lee. I'll be honest, I've never liked either of their work. Jay Lee never met an excessive amount of shadow he didn't like, and Hairsine, no nice way to say it, his art is ugly. This story sees Cap's Native American friend fake his death for some reason, then he has a rogue contingent of S.H.I.E.L.D. operatives working for him for some reason. Later, those same operatives are back under Fury's command for some reason. Then he betrays a rogue S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who attacks Cap for some reason. Then he gives some drugs to Cap to help him see the truth for some reason. There's also clones, and he fades in and out of reality for some reason. And he wants to kill every white boy in the continent so his people can have their country back. And he has weather powers and gets to fight Thor a little. This whole story, if we can generously call it that, as fragmented as it feels, makes the previous one look like a masterpiece. Part of the problem is, halfway in, Reber is replaced with Chuck Austen, that bastion of quality stories, apparently because Reber's vision for Captain America didn't match Joe Quesada's vision. I think that would be something you would hammer out before you hired a guy, but this isn't the first time this kind of thing has happened. It's hard to tell what parts we can blame Reber for and which ones we can blame Austen for, as both of their names are on issues 8 and 9, but it doesn't matter who we blame because this whole story is guano. You might want to give Austen a pass since he inherited a story that wasn't his, with weird, insane elements he didn't come up with, and he had to make it work. But even when it's just Austen in the writer's seat, he's still adding insane stuff to the already insane story, so we can't grant him any mercy. We already had an insane rogue S.H.I.E.L.D. agent with weather powers dosing Cap so he hallucinates some stuff. Don't worry, we'll get to that. But Austen decides to add clones into the mix. The bad guy has clones that are somehow connected to him fading in and out, and when they're destroyed, he will also die. If you want to know how it works, get in line. As is tradition with this run, nothing is explained. Unfortunately, this story leads right into the next one, as Cap finds out the US government deliberately wanted him put on ice because, I hope you're sitting down, for the most insane thing in this run, because they thought Cap would prevent them from dropping nukes in World War II. I like Cap, he's pretty strong, but I'm not exactly sure how they, or Chuck Austen, thought he was strong enough to stop an entire government from pushing a couple of buttons. And while he was on ice, the US government took some cell samples from him and from Bucky, somehow, even though we later find out the Russians had Bucky, and the US government tries to clone Cap, as he wouldn't follow orders. But the clones are basically brain dead and end up working for Cap's crazy friend. The third story, illustrated by Jay Lee, has Cap investigating the US government betraying him, and we find out some scientist gets his hand chopped off by an out-of-it Cap, his hand gets replaced with some Lemurian technology, then he goes to hang out with the Lemurians even though he was dissecting them. He wants Cap to kill as per orders from Del Rusk, who is the Red Skull with the least creative alias I've ever seen in my life. The Del Rusk thing was going on in the Avengers at the time, I guess, and he wants this scientist with the hand that looks like it belongs in the dark part of the internet to get Cap to kill. I'm only a casual Cap fan, but I would have thought in his time in the war, that boat would have already sailed. But I guess not. So this guy puts Cap through some mental torture, trying to get him to kill, or at least admit he is willing to kill. Eventually, Cap cuts his hand off, which was the only thing keeping him alive. But I'm not sure why, because this guy shouldn't be that old. If they're retconning the circumstances of Cap coming out of the ice, then this guy would have been in his prime, I guess, 13-ish years ago. If they said he was around during World War II, and the hand was all that kept him alive, I guess I would get that. That concludes this big volume I have, and I have to say, if this was someone's first comic, I wouldn't blame them if they pulled a Frederick Wertham and tried to take down the entire comic book industry. This was offensive not because of any political stance it makes, but because it sucked. There is no reason someone getting paid to be a creator of the arts should be this bad across the board. You don't hear people talk about this run very much, which, when you look at it, is understandable. But this is when Cap reveals his identity to the world, and that's still a thing after this. So we have this weird situation where the creators and fans silently agree to pretend 99% of this trash never happened. At some point, Steve reveals his identity to the world, and the rest, maybe everyone was high on that stuff Steve's friend had. It's all a big blur. I wish it was a big blur. Anyway, that's all for today. I hope you were at least entertained that I had to suffer through this. Until next time, have a good one.